The wind carried dust through the narrow street, whispering secrets of a town that had long forgotten mercy. In the center of it all, bound to a wooden post, stood a girl with her wrists tied high above her head. Her skin was scraped raw from the dirt, her dress torn until one shoulder was bare, and the cold air cut into her like blades of glass. The crowd gathered not out of duty but for spectacle, their eyes shining with something cruel, as if punishment was entertainment. She kept her head bowed, not because she lacked pride, but because looking into their faces would only deepen the ache already twisting in her chest. Her lips were cracked from thirst, her stomach hollow from hunger, yet she did not cry where they could see. She counted her breaths and held them like fragile treasures, willing herself to remain standing when her knees threatened to give way. The whip cracked once in the dirt, close enough to make her flinch. Laughter rippled through the men watching, rough and sharp like broken glass. She shut her eyes and braced herself for the first blow, whispering a silent prayer that it would be quick. And then the air shifted. Footsteps, steady and deliberate, broke through the murmur of the crowd. A tall figure stepped out from the shadows between the saloon and the livery, his long coat dusted from the trail, a rifle hanging loose at his side. His face was carved in silence, eyes calm yet cold as steel. He didn't shout, didn't wave his weapon. He simply stood, a single man against the jeering crowd, and when he spoke, his voice carried like thunder through dry air. "Untie her!" The man holding the whip sneered, spit hitting the ground. "Sheriff said she waits." But the stranger's hand dropped his rifle forward, not threatening, not careless, simply ready. He repeated the words, slower, like they were already law. "Untie her." Silence rolled over the crowd, broken only by a woman tugging her boy backward, a cough somewhere near the back. The whip holder hesitated, then stepped away. Rope loosened, hands fell, and her arms, trembling from hours of strain, nearly gave out beneath her. She would have collapsed into the dirt if not for the stranger's hand, firm at her elbow, steady as a promise. He draped his coat over her shoulders, heavy and warm, carrying the faint scent of leather and smoke. The fabric swallowed her, but she clutched it closed like a shield, the first comfort she had felt in months. Without looking back, he guided her through the gawking crowd, his palm light against her back, not a shove, not a claim, simply guidance. The murmurs faded as they stepped beyond the edge of town, out toward the cottonwood grove where his horse waited. He lifted her gently, swung into the saddle behind her, and with the slow, measured rhythm of hooves, carried her away from the cruelty of strangers into the quiet of the valley. Every step of the horse loosened something inside her, a knot of fear that had lived in her chest for too long. She did not know his name, did not know why he had stepped forward, but as the ridge swallowed the last glimpse of town, she pressed her cheek against the warmth of the coat and felt, for the first time in years, the faint whisper of safety. Dusk painted the valley in strokes of gold and ash when they reached his cabin, a place small but sturdy, tucked against the trees as though the forest itself guarded it. Smoke curled soft from the chimney, promising warmth. He dismounted, lifted her down with care, and for a heartbeat their eyes met. In his gaze there was no judgment, only the unspoken weight of a man who had seen enough of the world to recognize suffering when it stood before him. Inside, the air smelled of firewood and earth. He lit the lamp, stoked the flames higher, and set a tin plate of beans and a cup of water before her. She ate with trembling hands, every bite both relief and ache, as if her body had forgotten how kindness tasted. He said little, only pointed to a bedroll by the hearth when she finished. His voice was quiet, but carried warmth beneath its gravel. She wanted to thank him, but no words rose, only a heavy tide of gratitude she carried in her silence. Curling under the weight of his coat, the fire's hiss and the sound of his steady breathing soothed her into sleep, like healing woven gently through the night air. Morning came pale and thin through the cracks of the shutter. He woke to silence, the bedroll empty, the coat gone. For a long moment he stood, listening to the valley's breath. He was not surprised. Most who found his door left before dawn. That was how he had built his life. People came, people went, and the cabin remained. But when he stepped outside, she was there, waiting by the fence line, her hair loose around her face, the coat still wrapped close. She had returned, not to beg, not to flee, but to stay. If this story stirs even a small warmth in your heart, I invite you to linger with me. Leave your thoughts in a comment, share what you feel, and if you wish to walk further into this tale, subscribe. Every gesture of support is more than numbers. It is a light, a healing touch that lets stories like this continue to breathe. And as their journey unfolds, know that your presence here shapes it too, giving strength to each word, each moment that follows into the next chapter of their lives. The valley woke slowly, a hush of pines swaying above the cabin, the frost melting silver across the meadow grass. She stood there, still in his coat, her dark eyes lowered as though waiting for rejection, yet her feet remained planted firmly near the fence. The man, Colt, had lived long years convinced he was meant for solitude, that his cabin and his silence were all he had left to guard. But as his gaze settled on her fragile figure, shoulders squared despite exhaustion, something in him shifted. Without words, he tilted his head toward the woodpile. She understood. She moved, her small hands gathering logs one by one, stacking them carefully against the cabin wall. Every piece she lifted was like a quiet offering, not of apology, but of presence. Inside, the fire welcomed them with soft warmth. She hovered near the doorway until he gestured for her to sit. He set beans to simmer again, this time with a strip of jerky, the simple act filling the cabin with a smell both grounding and familiar. She ate slowly, her eyes flicking toward him between bites, as if gauging whether this kindness might dissolve into cruelty. He gave her nothing but silence, yet it was a silence that healed rather than harmed. When she finished, her voice, hesitant but steady, finally rose. "I'll go if you want me to." Colt shook his head once. "You're fine here." The words seemed plain, but to her they carried the weight of shelter, of being allowed to exist without chains. She lowered her shoulders, as though a storm inside her had calmed, and for the first time in too long she did not prepare herself to run. She swept the floor without being asked, carried water from the creek, her steps careful on the frozen earth. Each task steadied her, mending something frayed within. When she winced at the raw skin around her ankle, he noticed, fetched a cloth, and poured whiskey over it. The sting brought tears to her eyes, but she tied it firm, whispering thanks through the pain. He returned to his place by the hearth, oiling his rifle, but his eyes lingered on her hands as they stitched a torn shirt of his with neat, certain movements. When her own dress gaped open at the collar, she froze, clutching it shut. He rose, needle and thread in hand, voice low. "Give it here." Fear flashed across her face until she saw the thread. Slowly she handed him the dress. He bent close to the fire, rough fingers working with surprising gentleness, mending what was broken. When he returned it, their fingers brushed briefly, a touch quick as a spark, yet it stayed with them both. The evening settled heavy with silence, but not the empty silence of strangers. She sat by the fire, speaking at last, words soft as falling snow. "They said I stole." His eyes met hers. "Did you?" She nodded. "I hadn't eaten in 3 days. I tried to work." They laughed. He did not offer pity, nor did he condemn her. His voice was steady, healing in its simplicity. "You're safe here." Those 3 words pierced deeper than any kindness she had known, bringing a sting of tears she hid quickly. She lay again on the bedroll, curling into his coat while he cleaned his revolver with methodical patience. Outside, the wind rose, rattling the shutters, yet for the first time she slept without fear's claws raking her dreams. Morning light returned pale and fragile, carrying with it the sound of boots outside. He reached for his revolver, but when he opened the door, there she stood again, arms full of kindling, cheeks flushed from the cold. She had not left. She braided her hair back with a strip of leather, her face sharper now, stronger, and she moved through the cabin as though each step was stitching her into its walls. She laid food before him, warmed beans and bread, and ate beside him in silence that no longer weighed heavy, but instead felt like belonging. Later, when he spoke of riding into town for supplies, she stiffened, fear flickering across her eyes. He saw it, hesitated, then nodded once. "You ride with me." She obeyed, pulling his coat close, and when they entered the town together, whispers followed. The storekeeper sneered, but Colt's voice cut like iron. "She's with me." Coins clattered onto the counter, and he bought what she needed. Flour, coffee, soap, cloth. The townfolk stared, muttered, but none dared raise a hand. By the time they rode back to the valley, her breath released in a long sigh. "They hate me," she whispered. He adjusted his hat, answering quiet but firm. "Let them." She looked back at him, searching his face. "Why do you help me?" He held her gaze for a long time before answering. "Because I've seen what happens when no one does." The words were few, but they carried the weight of a man who bore ghosts on his shoulders. Back at the cabin, she bathed in the cold creek with the soap he had bought, her skin raw but clean. He stood near, tending the horse, his eyes turning deliberately away, yet his presence a shield. That night she worked with the cloth, cutting strips to repair her dress, humming softly under her breath. He sharpened his knife, listening to the fragile melody, a sound that warmed the cabin more than the fire. When she pricked her finger, he was at her side in an instant, thumb brushing the bead of blood, wrapping her hand with care, as though reminding himself not to cross a line he had long guarded. "Thank you," she said, and her gaze lingered, stirring something in him that had long slept. He cleared his throat, turned back to the fire, but the shift had already begun. The storm would come soon, heavy with snow, pressing them together in that cabin where silence turned from shield into bond. And though danger still lingered at the edges of their world, in that moment she felt herself healing, each task, each word, each shared glance stitching her closer, not only to safety, but to him. The cabin no longer seemed a stranger's refuge. It began to feel like the fragile beginnings of home, carrying them quietly into the days that would follow, where fear would test them again, and the warmth they had found would be forced to stand against the cold beyond the door. Dawn crept through the valley with a muted hush, the sky pale as polished bone, the frost clinging stubbornly to the trees. Colt rose from his bunk with the unshakable habit of a man who rarely trusted sleep to linger too long. The fire had burned down to coals, but he coaxed it back to life with practiced hands, the crackle and flare of flame answering him like an old companion. The cabin was quiet, except for the soft shifting of fabric near the hearth. She was there, curled beneath his coat on the bedroll, breathing slow, her face turned toward the fire's glow. For a long moment he simply watched, noting how the sharp lines of fear that had etched her features on that first day were softening, replaced by something gentler. She looked younger in rest, yet stronger too, like a sapling bent but not broken by the storm. When her eyes finally fluttered open, she blinked against the firelight and sat up slowly, pulling the coat tighter around her shoulders. Her hair fell loose, strands catching the light like dark silk. She did not speak, not at once, but busied herself feeding wood into the flames. The small domestic act carried weight, as if she were quietly declaring her place within these walls. Colt watched her move, his rifle resting across his knees as always, though his grip had eased. For years he had measured his days by the sound of iron being cleaned and oiled, by the quiet discipline of survival. Now, for the first time, another rhythm pressed into that silence, the sound of her hands arranging the fire, the gentle clink of tin cups as she set them on the table. Breakfast was plain, warmed beans, a heel of bread. They ate without hurry, without shame. She no longer hid her face as she had before. Her gaze lifted now and again, uncertain but steady, as if learning she was allowed to meet his eyes. When he rose to fetch his hat and spoke of going into town again for supplies, her fingers curled around the edge of the table, a tremor of fear betraying her calm. He saw it and paused, his jaw tightening. Then his voice, even and low, "You'll ride with me." She nodded, relief and dread mingling in her breath, and pulled the coat close as though it could shield her from every whisper waiting there. The ride down the frozen trail was quiet. She sat before him on the saddle, her back straight but her hands trembling where they clutched the fabric at her chest. His arm rested lightly against her side, steadying her when the horse stumbled over the icy path. The town came into view with its crooked roofs and thin trails of smoke curling into the cold air. Faces turned as they entered, whispers trailing like smoke. He dismounted with the same calm he carried into every fight, tied the horse, and lifted her down carefully. When they stepped into the mercantile, the storekeeper's sneer was sharp as a blade. "You got nerve, bringing her back." Colt's answer was steady, unyielding. "She's with me." Coins clattered onto the counter. Flour, coffee, jerky, cloth. Paid in full. No argument followed. The steel in his voice made sure of it. They left beneath the weight of 100 stares, but none dared step forward. When the horse carried them back to the quiet of the valley, she released a breath she had been holding too long. "They hate me," she said, her voice raw. His answer came as steady as the rhythm of hooves. "Let them." She turned her face slightly, searching his profile beneath the brim of his hat. Why do you help me?" The question hung between them, heavy as snowfall. He did not answer at once. When he did, it was simple, like truth worn smooth by time. "Because I've seen what happens when no one does." At the cabin, she bathed in the creek, the water biting cold but washing the dirt from her skin. He stood a distance away, busying himself with the horse, eyes turned deliberately elsewhere. Yet his presence was near enough to hold danger at bay. She returned with her skin red from the chill, but clean, and for the first time her face seemed wholly her own. That night the lamp glowed low while she cut the cloth he had bought, stitching carefully by the fire. Her humming, soft and almost shy, filled the room with a fragile sweetness. Colt sat across from her, sharpening his knife, but his gaze often drifted to her hands, to the small curve of her smile when the stitches fell neatly. When the needle pricked her skin and she hissed, he was beside her in an instant. His thumb brushed the bead of blood away, his touch careful, almost reverent. He wrapped her finger with a strip of cloth, his hand lingering a heartbeat longer than needed. "Thank you," she whispered, and her eyes lingered on his in a way that stirred something long dormant inside him. The storm came with a roar, snow slashing against the shutters, the world outside consumed in white fury. The cabin shrank to a circle of warmth and flickering firelight. She sat close to the hearth, stitching still, though her hands trembled each time the wind rattled the door. He moved his bedroll closer, rifle within reach, yet his presence steady as stone. When a gust struck hard enough to shake the walls, she startled, her hand grasping the edge of his coat without thought. He looked at her hand, then at her face, and spoke quietly. "You're safe." She let go, embarrassed, but the words had already wrapped around her like another blanket. Night deepened, and the storm's fury did not relent. She curled under her blanket, shivering despite the fire. He rose without a word, draped another over her shoulders, and sat back down. She looked up at him, startled, then nodded, her lips curving faintly. He settled again, stretching his long legs, and though his eyes remained on the fire, he was keenly aware of her breathing steadying, of her presence only a few feet away. For 3 days he had been alone in this valley, preparing to leave it before winter closed the trails. Now she was here, and solitude no longer pressed so heavy. He wondered, as the snow thickened outside, if perhaps leaving was no longer his only choice. She, too, lay awake longer than she admitted, her eyes tracing the hard lines of his jaw softened by firelight. Fear no longer gripped her as it once had. She had seen the way he stood in town, the way his voice cut through the noise when he said, "Untie her." That memory carried her through the storm. She shifted closer to the fire, and the brush of his coat against her sleeve steadied her heartbeat. Sleep came slowly, but it came without nightmares. When morning finally broke, the storm had not passed. The world outside was white, the valley hushed beneath a blanket of snow. Yet inside the cabin there was warmth, and within that warmth the faintest seed of something that felt like belonging. It was not yet spoken, not yet named, but it was there, threaded into each shared silence, each careful gesture. It carried them forward, from one breath to the next, into a day where the dangers of the town would return, and their fragile peace would be tested once more. Snow pressed heavy against the cabin roof, each gust of wind howling like the voice of some wild spirit roaming the valley. Inside, the fire burned steady, its light spilling over rough-hewn walls and the two figures who now shared its glow. She sat on the floor, closer to the warmth than the bench, her knees drawn up beneath the heavy coat. Her needle flashed as she repaired the last tear in her dress, the careful rhythm of her hands a quiet hymn of survival. Colt sat opposite her, a whetstone rasping softly against his knife, his eyes drifting often from the blade to the gentle bend of her shoulders. Their silence was no longer a wall. It had become a bridge, each heartbeat carrying them across the distance between strangers and something more fragile, more alive. When the storm shook the shutters, she startled, her hand reaching for the coat sleeve beside her, as though his presence alone could anchor her. He set down the knife, his voice low but firm, the kind of tone that settled storms within as much as without. Doors barred. Nothing comes through. She exhaled slowly, her shoulders loosening, and though she released his sleeve, the memory of his words stayed wrapped around her like a second blanket. She shifted closer to the fire, sitting almost knee to knee with him, her breath soft in the hush between gusts. For a long moment, the only sound was the crackle of wood, the snow hissing faintly as it struck the chimney stones. Colt studied her face, lit by firelight, the lines of weariness softened by warmth. She turned her eyes up at him, a flicker of uncertainty in her gaze. "You could send me away when the storm clears," she said, her voice even but fragile beneath the calm. His jaw tightened, thumb rubbing absently over the hilt of the knife. "You could leave if you wanted." She shook her head, slow and steady. "There is nowhere else. If I go back, they will tie me again. If I go farther, I will starve." He nodded once, accepting her truth without question. No promises, no oaths, just understanding. By late afternoon, the storm still raged, and the cabin had shrunk into a cocoon of firelight and shadows. She mended one of his socks, humming softly again, a tune with no name, only warmth. He watched her hands moving, his rifle lying forgotten on the table beside him. When she handed the sock back, their fingers brushed longer this time, the contact lingering as though neither wished to break it. She lowered her gaze quickly, but her lips curved with the faintest trace of a smile she hadn't worn in months. That evening, they lay their bedrolls closer than before, the edges brushing so that his coat touched her sleeve when she shifted. A fierce gust rattled the cabin walls, and without thinking, she gripped the edge of his coat again. He looked at her hand, then at her face, her eyes wide but unafraid this time. "You're safe," he whispered, softer than before. She let her hand linger, then released it slowly, turning onto her side. Sleep came easier, her breathing steady, while Colt lay awake, listening to the storm, but less burdened by its weight. By dawn, the valley had fallen quiet under a thick blanket of snow. She woke first, feeding the fire with small, careful hands, moving as though she had always belonged here. When Colt stirred, she had already set out 2 tin cups, steam rising from them. He watched her move, saw the way her braid framed her face, no longer disheveled, no longer beaten down by hunger and fear. She sat across from him at the table, and for the first time their silence felt like companionship. Later, he saddled the horse to check the lower pasture. He hesitated at the door, glancing back toward her. "You'll be all right here alone?" She met his eyes, steady now, not shrinking as she once had. "I will keep the fire." The words were simple, but they carried more weight than a promise. They were a vow to hold on to the warmth, to keep their fragile world alive until his return. Colt nodded once, then rode into the snow. She swept the floor, carried water from the creek, her breath misting in the frozen air. Each small task rooted her deeper into this place, as though each stroke of the broom, each trip with the bucket, stitched her to the cabin walls. By the time he returned, snow clung to his coat, his eyes sharp with unease. "There were tracks," he said, voice low. "2 riders, close enough to be watching." She stilled, fear flickering across her face. "They'll bring me back," she whispered. His jaw hardened. "Not while you're under my roof." He said it with the same weight he had carried into town, steady as an oath carved in stone. That night, when hoofbeats echoed faintly through the valley, Colt took his rifle and stepped onto the porch. She crouched by the hearth, heart racing, until she heard his voice cut through the dark, firm as iron. "She doesn't belong to you." The men spat their threats into the cold, but Colt's calm refusal sent them away into the snow. When he returned, her hands trembled where she clutched the coat, but when he knelt and met her eyes, his voice was softer, steady enough to mend the cracks in her chest. "No one's taking you." She reached out, her fingers brushing his sleeve, the first time she touched him by choice, and in her silence was all the gratitude she could not voice. As the storm deepened, they returned to their places by the fire, but something between them had shifted. It was no longer only survival, no longer only the healing of hunger and fear. It was trust, woven, fragile but strong, stitched in every glance, every word, every quiet moment they now shared. And though danger still lingered at the edges of the valley, the warmth inside the cabin grew stronger, carrying them forward into nights where silence no longer felt like solitude, but the fragile beginnings of love. The snow had begun to harden into a crust of ice when the sound of hooves carried once more up the valley. Colt rose from the table with a calm that did not belong to the storm outside, but to something steadier, something forged long ago, when he had learned never to meet fear with haste. He reached for the rifle, checked the chamber, and glanced toward her. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice even, and though her breath caught, she shook her head. "I will not hide." He studied her face, the determined line of her jaw, and after a pause, he gave a single nod. "Then stay close." When the door opened to the cold, the 3 riders waited beyond the porch, their horses shifting nervously in the snow. The deputy sat in the middle, hat low, his voice carrying sharp against the frozen air. "Sheriff says this is the last ask. Bring her in, and it's done." Colt stepped forward, rifle loose in his grip, his stance as unyielding as the ridge behind him. "She stays here." The man to the left spat, reaching for his rifle strap. Colt's Henry lifted in one fluid motion, barrel leveled. "Don't." The word fell like a stone into still water, leaving silence in its wake. She stepped onto the porch then, chin lifted though her hands trembled. Her voice, steady but soft, cut through the hush. "I took bread because I was hungry. That is all." For a moment the world held its breath. The deputy looked from her to Colt, his expression uneasy. At last he sighed. "Sheriff won't ride out here again. Keep her clear of town, and it's square." He tugged his reins, and the men turned their horses, muttering as they retreated into the pale distance. Colt lowered the rifle, the tension in his shoulders easing as the hoofbeats faded. She touched his sleeve lightly, her voice trembling not with fear, but with something gentler. "You stood for me again." He looked down, eyes hard from the standoff but softened when they met hers. "I told you I would." Together they stepped back inside, closing the door against the cold. The fire crackled, shadows leaping across the cabin walls, and for the first time since dawn she let out a breath that felt whole. Through the rest of the day they worked in near silence, though silence had become less a barrier and more a companion. She cooked a thin stew from the last of the potatoes and salt pork, her movements surer now, steady in the rhythm of a home that had once felt like exile, but now carried warmth. When she placed the bowl before him, his gaze lingered a moment longer than usual, his voice roughened but sincere. "You've made this place warmer." She lowered her eyes quickly, hiding the faint smile that curved her lips. "I only keep the fire going." His answer was quiet, almost an admission. "That's more than most ever did." Evening settled heavy, the storm thickening outside. Colt sat at the table, cleaning the revolver piece by piece, the careful ritual that kept his hands steady and his mind clear. Across from him, she mended the last strip of cloth into her dress, each stitch a small reclaiming of dignity. The fire's glow painted her face, not just weary but alive, carrying the faint light of someone who had been pulled back from the edge of despair. He watched her, unspoken thoughts pressing at the walls of his chest, until at last he set the revolver aside. "Before you came, I was planning to ride south before winter shut the trails." Her head lifted sharply, alarm flickering across her eyes. "You would leave this place?" He nodded once, his voice calm. "I had nothing holding me here. Now I do." The words settled between them with the weight of truth, heavier than snow, warmer than fire. She turned her face toward the hearth, hiding the way her chest rose and fell with emotion she could not yet name. But when she placed his mended shirt beside him, her fingers brushed his hand, and this time he did not pull away. Instead, his hand turned, holding hers briefly, long enough for silence to say what neither dared to speak aloud. That night, the wind howled fierce, shaking the cabin walls, but inside there was steadiness. She lay on her bedroll closer than ever before, the edge of his coat brushing her arm. When the storm struck hard enough to rattle snow from the roof, she startled and reached for him without thought. His hand found hers, strong and steady, and he whispered again the words that had become a balm. "You're safe." Sleep came slower for him, but when it did, it carried with it a strange lightness, as though the years of silence he had wrapped around his life were beginning to loosen. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the valley buried in white. He rose early, cutting wood in the brittle air while she moved through the cabin with quiet confidence, tending the fire, straightening blankets, setting his cup where he always kept it. When he returned, cheeks raw from the cold, she handed him the steaming tin without being asked. "You didn't sleep much," she said softly. His answer came with a faint smile, rare but real. "Never do when there's trouble coming." Her eyes lingered on him, then lowered, but in her silence was a promise. She would keep the fire as he kept the watch. The days that followed pressed them closer, not only by storm and danger, but by choice. The whispers of town still lingered like shadows, and tracks appeared now and then near the creek, proof that someone was watching. Yet within the cabin, warmth grew steadier. Shared meals, shared glances, the hum of her voice while she sewed, the quiet way his hand would linger an instant longer when passing her a cup. Each moment stitched them tighter into something neither had sought. yet both had begun to need. And when night came again, and the fire burned low, the distance between them narrowed. She lay with her blanket close enough that his sleeve brushed her arm, and when her hand sought his in the dark, he did not hesitate. The silence was no longer heavy. It was healing, carrying them gently toward a closeness neither had planned, but both had already claimed. The cabin, once a place of exile, was becoming a home. The two of them, once strangers bound only by chance, were becoming something steadier, forged in firelight and snow, and carried forward into the nights yet to come. The sky lowered heavy with grey, carrying the scent of snow that had not yet fallen. Colt rose early, restless, his instincts honed sharp by years of waiting for storms, both of weather and of men. She was already awake, crouched by the fire, sewing the last strip of cloth into her dress. Her braid was tied tight, her face sharper than before, no longer the girl tied to a post, but a woman reclaiming herself piece by piece. When she finished, she smoothed the fabric over her chest and looked at him as if awaiting judgment. He met her gaze, the corner of his mouth tilting in the faintest nod. Fits. The word was plain, but it made her lips curve in a smile soft and certain, the kind that stitched warmth into silence. After breakfast he saddled the horse, preparing to ride to the lower pasture and check the fence line. He hesitated at the doorway, eyes lingering on her where she stood by the hearth. "You'll be all right here?" She nodded, her voice steady, quiet as prayer. "I will keep the fire." He gave a single nod, then rode out into the brittle air. For the first time in years, she was left alone with a roof overhead and no rope on her wrists. The cabin felt strange in his absence, but not hollow. She swept the floor, carried water from the creek, stacked wood by the hearth. Each act, simple as it was, rooted her deeper, made her feel less like a fugitive and more like someone with a place. By the time Colt returned, snow had begun to fall in fine flurries. His eyes were sharp, his jaw tight. "There were tracks," he said, brushing cold from his coat. "2 riders. They came close." She froze, her hands stilling where she folded a blanket. "They'll bring me back," she whispered. He shook his head, voice steady as stone. "Not while you're under my roof." The words struck deep, heavier than promises. She clutched the coat tighter around her shoulders, and in the quiet that followed, she believed him. They kept the lamp low that evening, the storm swelling outside. He worked on a broken hinge by the door, steady hands moving with purpose, while she stirred a thin stew in the pot. The quiet between them was not empty. It pulsed with a watchful closeness, like 2 hearts learning to beat in rhythm. When the sound of hoofbeats finally rose through the valley, Colt's rifle clicked as he checked the chamber. "Stay by the fire," he said. She obeyed, crouching low as he stepped onto the porch. The voice outside was the same as before, rough, laced with arrogance. "Maddox, you got something belongs to the town." Colt's reply carried calm finality. "She doesn't belong to you." A silence followed, tense as drawn wire, before the man spat in the snow. "This ain't finished." Their hoofbeats retreated, but the threat remained heavy in the night air. When Colt came back inside, he crouched before her, rifle still in hand. Her eyes were wide, breath trembling. He spoke softer now, almost like an oath only meant for her. "No one's taking you." Her shoulders shook once, a breath breaking free, as if she had been holding it all day. She reached out, her hand brushing his sleeve, the first touch freely given. His eyes met hers, steady, and something unspoken passed between them, something that warmed the air more than fire. Later, when the stew was eaten and the dishes washed, the storm thickened, rattling the shutters. They sat across the hearth, she sewing one of his shirts, he watching her hands. Their fingers brushed when she handed it back, but this time neither pulled away quickly. He held her gaze, his voice lower than before. "Get some rest." She hesitated, then laid her bedroll close enough that the hem of his coat brushed against her blanket. He did not move away. She watched the fire until sleep closed her eyes, her breathing soft and even. Colt stayed awake, the rifle within reach, but his grip no longer as tight. His eyes lingered on her quiet form, and for the first time in years, the silence of the cabin no longer felt like exile. It felt like something alive. Morning came with the storm's fury breaking hard against the valley. Snow hissed against the shutters, piling high along the door. Colt fed the fire, his movements deliberate, while she brewed coffee in the tin pot, her hands steady now, no longer trembling with fear. She handed him the cup, her fingers brushing his. The firelight caught her face, and he saw strength there, where once there had only been hunger and weariness. They ate in silence, but it was no longer heavy. It was companionable, healing, a rhythm of two lives stitching themselves together. By afternoon, the storm grew fierce, howling through the pines. She startled when the door rattled, moving instinctively closer to him. He set aside the whetstone, met her eyes, and said evenly, "Door's barred. Nothing's coming through." She nodded, but she did not move back. Instead, she lowered herself to the floor near the fire, her knees almost brushing his. They sat that way, the storm pressing in, the fire pushing back, until the quiet stretched into something fragile, charged. He studied her face, the soft curve of her lips, the strength that had grown in her eyes. She lifted her gaze, and when her hand reached for his arm, he did not pull away. His hand turned, covering hers, rough skin against delicate. His voice dropped, almost a whisper. "You're not afraid of me anymore." She shook her head. "I never was." "Only of what would happen when you sent me away." He exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "That's not happening." Her breath caught, and before she could think, she leaned closer. His eyes searched hers, asking without words. Then he closed the distance. The kiss was slow, unhurried, a promise unspoken but true. Her hand tightened on his arm, his palm resting against her back, steadying her as though he had always meant to. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney, but neither looked away. When at last they parted, their foreheads lingered close, their breaths mingling. Colt let out a slow breath, as if some weight he had carried for years had loosened. "Get some sleep," he said softly, but the edge of his voice had changed, gentler now. She nodded, laying down her bedroll closer than ever, so that the brush of her blanket touched his boot. The storm raged outside, but inside there was warmth, a warmth not born of wood and flame alone, but of something far deeper, something neither had sought, yet both had found. Healing lingered in the hush, in the quiet rhythm of their breathing. And as she drifted into sleep, her heart steadied by the memory of his words and his touch, Colt kept his watch by the fire, his eyes softer than the flames, knowing that from this night forward nothing in his life would ever be the same. The storm had left the valley buried in white silence, the sky clearing to a pale blue that promised more cold. Colt stood on the porch that morning, scanning the ridgeline with steady eyes. Snow glittered like shards of glass across the ground, but what he searched for were the faintest signs of riders. He knew men like the storekeeper didn't let grudges die easily. She came to stand just inside the doorway, her new coat wrapped close, her breath misting faint in the morning light. "You think they'll ride up today?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. He didn't look back, his gaze fixed on the empty road. "They'll wait for clear ground to make a show of it. But yes, they'll come." She tightened her hands around the coat, and for a long moment she only watched him, the tall figure standing against the cold with a rifle never far from reach. The day passed slowly, each hour stretching thin with the weight of waiting. Colt split wood, stacking it higher than usual near the door, half to stay busy, half to fortify the cabin if it came to it. She swept the floor, cooked what little meat and potatoes were left, her movements calm, but carrying the taut rhythm of someone who had learned to live inside storms. By dusk, the sound of riders came at last, 3 this time, their approach deliberate, hooves crunching through snow. Colt reached for his rifle, checked the chamber, and looked at her once. "Stay back!" But she shook her head, jaw firm, eyes lit with resolve. "I will not hide." He wanted to argue, but when he saw the steel in her gaze, he only nodded. "Then stay behind me." He opened the door, stepping into the sharp bite of evening air. The 3 riders halted several yards away, snow steaming beneath their horses. The deputy sat in the middle, hat brim low, his voice carrying across the stillness. "Sheriff says this is the last ask. Bring her in, and we'll call it square." Colt's reply came even, steady as bedrock. "She stays here." The man on the left spat into the snow, hand twitching near his rifle. "You planning to hold up and shoot your way out?" Colt's Henry lifted in a single smooth motion, barrel leveled with quiet finality. "If I have to." The words cut through the cold like steel drawn from its sheath. She stepped onto the porch then, standing just behind Colt's shoulder, her hands trembling, but her chin lifted high. "I stole bread," she said, her voice clear, carrying farther than she thought possible. "Because I was hungry, that is all." The horses shifted, uneasy in the silence that followed. The deputy's gaze moved from her to Colt, then back again. At last he exhaled, shoulders sagging. "Sheriff won't ride out here again. He'll call it done if she stays clear of town." Colt lowered the rifle just slightly, though his stance did not ease. "She will." The deputy gave one last nod, then tugged his reins. The 3 riders turned, their hoofbeats fading into the valley's quiet. When the sound was gone, Colt let out a slow breath, lowering the Henry. She moved closer, her hand brushing against his sleeve, her voice soft, almost fragile. "You stood for me again." He looked down, his eyes still hard from the standoff, but softening when they met hers. "I told you I would." They stood there on the porch a moment longer, watching the road until the last trace of the riders vanished into dusk. And then Colt guided her back inside, closing the door against the cold. The cabin felt warmer that night, though the fire was no higher than before. She crouched near the hearth, her face no longer pale with fear, but touched with something else. Relief, gratitude, and the faint glow of trust. "You could have been shot," she whispered. "So could they," Colt answered simply, his voice quiet but steady. She reached out, her palm resting against his chest, her touch tentative yet certain. "I'm not afraid anymore," she said. His jaw worked, as though words wanted to rise, but instead he laid his hand gently over hers, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her fingers. They stayed like that until the fire cracked, sending sparks up the chimney, both silent, both certain. Something had shifted that could not be undone. Later, when she laid her bedroll down, it was closer than ever, the edge of her blanket brushing his sleeve. He sat by the fire long after she closed her eyes, his rifle still within reach, but not gripped as tightly. His gaze rested not only on the flames, but on the quiet form beside him. Outside, the valley was cold and endless, but inside there was warmth, fragile and healing, a closeness born not of chance alone, but of choice. For the first time in years, Colt no longer felt the urge to leave at dawn. And for the first time in months, she no longer felt the fear of being cast out. The storm had not ended beyond the walls, but within the cabin they had found shelter not only in fire and wood, but in one another. The days that followed carried a rhythm neither of them had known before, a rhythm born not of fear, but of belonging. The snow softened across the valley, glittering under the pale sun like scattered diamonds. Colt rose early, the way he always had, but now when he stepped onto the porch, she was there beside him, her new coat drawn close, her hand finding his without needing to look. The cabin no longer felt like a solitary outpost against the world. It felt like something alive, warmed by more than fire. She moved through its rooms with quiet certainty, setting his cup in its place, folding blankets neatly, humming while she worked. Each note was healing, each step a gentle thread weaving her deeper into this place, into his life. In town, whispers lingered, but no one raised a hand again. When they rode together down the main street, heads turned, but eyes dropped quickly once they saw the steel in Colt's gaze. He bought her boots that fit, a winter coat heavy enough to shield her, small things but sacred in their newness. She looked at them with wonder, fingers running across the fabric as though touching a life she had never dared to imagine. "I never owned something new," she whispered once, and Colt, rough hands steady on hers, answered only, "Then this is a start." At night, when the fire burned low, they no longer slept apart. Her blanket lay on his bunk, her breath steady against his chest, his arm around her waist, as though he had always been meant to guard her even in dreams. For years he had carried the weight of ghosts, of failures he could not outrun. But in her presence, the stone in his chest loosened, replaced by something warm, something alive. She, who had once counted her breaths in fear while tied to a post, now breathed in the steady rhythm of safety, of a home found at last. Spring would come eventually, and with it new trials, but neither feared them. They had stood against the town, against hunger, against the storm, and still they remained. Together they repaired fences, stacked wood, tended fire, and mended clothes. It was the work of survival, yes, but more than that, it was the work of two lives stitching themselves into one. Each glance carried unspoken words, each touch whispered what neither needed to say aloud. One evening, As the sun sank behind the ridge and the valley glowed in shades of amber, she stood beside him on the porch, her hair catching the last light. "What now?" she asked softly. He looked out over the land, then back at her, his hand tightening around hers. "Now we make this place ours." She nodded, and in her smile was something steady, something sure. For the first time, she did not feel like someone who had been rescued. She felt like someone who had chosen to stay, and he felt like a man no longer running from his past. The cabin became more than wood and stone. It became a home filled with warmth that could not be stolen, a place where silence healed instead of cut. In their closeness, they discovered not just shelter, but love, quiet, fierce, and enduring. And though the world beyond might still carry whispers and storms, within those walls they had found a peace no one could tear away. If this story touched even a corner of your heart, I invite you to let it stay with you a little longer. Share your thoughts in the comments. Let your voice be part of this tale. And if you wish to walk further with stories that heal and warm the soul, please like and subscribe. Every gesture of support is a flame added to this fire, keeping it alive so more hearts may find comfort in its glow.